Therefore, my siblings, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, writes Paul, stand firm in the Lord in this way, my beloveds. It's a week when it is difficult to know what to say. It's a week when it's hard for me to think that there's anything to say. But it's also a week when something needs to be said. Something needs to be said in humility and in humanity. Really, I think it's a week when it's more important to listen than to speak. To listen to the voices of people who have lost dear ones in the horror of what's been going on and what is still going on in Israel and in Gaza. In that spirit of respectful, prayerful listening, I've paid attention to the news even on days when I would really rather have turned it off and put it aside and thought of other things, of anything else. And in that spirit of respectful, prayerful listening, Charlene and I went yesterday morning to be with our siblings at B'nai Jeshurun, knowing that with that prayerful and powerful community of faith, we would hear something different from all those other louder voices that swirl around us. And of course we did. The anguish and fear and frustration and anger were present there and palpable. The stories of loved ones, family members missing, dead, or still in harm's way. But also the recognition that the tragedy of this moment is shared by those living in Gaza, also living in anguish and fear and frustration and anger. And alongside the sharing by Rabbi Becca and Rabbi Felicia, I found myself listening very carefully to the words of Torah, even though it was being read in Hebrew, and even though, because over the years it's becoming harder and harder for me to follow as I listen to the word read in Hebrew, or maybe because it's gotten harder. The portion was from Genesis 2 through 4, the story of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden and what happens next. And maybe I was paying more attention to all of that than usual because, like many of you, I have been spending time with Dr. Julie Parker's powerful book, Eve Isn't Evil. What occurred to me as I listened and I struggled to follow the Hebrew is that the idea of original sin, that strange Christian concept traced to these chapters, if it has any power and any relevance for us, probably has little to do with apples and trees and serpents, and has everything to do with the first murder, the killing of one brother by another brother, the killing of Abel by his brother Cain. And I found myself wondering, how is it possible that human beings, whom God creates, as God says, B'Shamenu Kidmutenu, in our image and in our likeness, how is it possible that we could so readily and quickly fall into hate and destruction? How is it possible if we are created in the image and the likeness of God? The events of the past week, and probably of this coming week and beyond, these events will make us question the humanity of humanity. And that drives me to want to grasp for some understanding, if not hope, and look to the scriptures and search my own faith. And so we come today to one of the letters of the Apostle Paul, who I have to say is not my usual go-to for how to be in the world. But in this letter, to the struggling church in Philippi. We have already heard and we now see Paul's effort to help a community of people drawn together in faith to keep from falling apart in division and rancor. The letter, as we've heard, is addressed to all the saints there in Philippi, and in particular to two women apostles, Euodia and Syntyche. And Paul is asking them all to remember a few crucial and critical things. First, mutual support. Remember what draws you together and who draws you together, my beloveds, he says. What you have in common is so much more than the things that are now driving you apart. Paul is asking them to remember that they exist because of each other and not in spite of each other. Second, he tells them, remember joy. Remember joy. You are together in the first place, and you are here today for joy. And so rejoice in the Lord always. And in case you didn't hear me the first time, I'll say it again. Rejoice. Rejoice. And that joy is not disconnected from the demands of the gospel, but part and parcel of a struggle for justice and peace and humanity and the doing of love. And third, Paul reminds them to please stay focused. Stay focused. Paul puts it this way: think about these things. Don't be distracted by the ways of the world. As Paul says so clearly in his other letter, that letter to the followers of Jesus in Rome, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may discern the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. To the followers in Philippi, Paul puts it this way: think about these things, whatever is true and honorable, the things that make for justice and joy. Focus on these things. And as you're focused, keep doing the things that make for truth, that spread honor, that make the way for justice and love. And Paul ends with a promise that in the doing of these things, they will not be alone, but the God of peace will be with them all the time. Paul obviously didn't know the Zulu and Xhosa word Ubuntu, but the idea that we exist not despite each other, but because of each other. But it seems that Paul feels that concept of Ubuntu deep in his soul and deep in his ethics and deep in his theology. And so it is as much a part of our Christian tradition as we think about what it means to be together as the one body of Christ. And so I want to close my remarks with the words of the gospel hymn we're about to sing a few times. I need you. You need me. We're all a part of God's body. Stand with me. Agree with me. It is God's will that every need be supplied. You are important to me. I need you to survive. May that become true in us, and may that somehow become true even in those terribly troubled places in our world. And so let's sing that together. I need you to survive.